The winter wind howled through the streets of New York City as Donald Trump stepped out of his black SUV, his overcoat wrapped tightly around him. He had just finished a high-profile business meeting and was headed to an exclusive dinner when something caught his eye. A man, barely dressed for the cold, sitting on the sidewalk near the entrance of a luxury hotel. The man's eyes were weary, his beard unkempt, and his hands trembled from the biting cold. A battered cardboard sign rested on his lap. U.S. Marine veteran, serve my country, now forgotten. Anything helps. God bless. Trump paused, his bodyguard shifting uneasily beside him. The former president had seen countless people in need before, but something about this man struck a nerve. Maybe it was the Marine Corps emblem on his worn-out jacket, or maybe it was the undeniable sense of pride still lingering in the veteran's gaze despite his hardships. Before anyone could react, Trump stepped forward. "Hey, what's your name?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. The veteran hesitated before looking up. "James Carter, sir. U.S. Marine. Served in Iraq and Afghanistan." Trump nodded. "And now you're out here, huh?" James let out a hollow chuckle. "Yeah, life's funny like that." Cameras flashed as bystanders recognized Trump, but he wasn't paying attention to the media. He crouched down to meet James at eye level, ignoring the cold pavement beneath him. "What happened?" Trump pressed. James exhaled sharply. "Lost my job, then my home. VA's been slow to help. My wife, she left. Been out here for months now." A long pause. The city noises seemed to fade into the background. Then Trump did something no one expected. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke firmly. "Find me a 5-star hotel nearby. I want a suite tonight, and I want a full medical checkup arranged." Now, the crowd gasped. The veteran's eyes widened. James tried to protest, but Trump held up a hand. "No arguments," Trump said. "You serve this country. Now let someone serve you." The moment was captured by a bystander, and within hours, the video had gone viral. James Carter sat in the back of Trump's SUV, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. The warmth of the heated seats felt foreign to him after months of sleeping on frozen concrete. Across from him, Trump was on a call, arranging for a team of doctors and career advisors to meet them at the hotel. James couldn't wrap his head around what was happening. Just an hour ago, he had been another forgotten veteran on the streets, struggling to survive. Now, he was sitting in the car of a billionaire, heading to a 5-star hotel. Trump ended the call and turned his attention back to James. "Tell me everything," he said. James hesitated but saw no harm in sharing his story. "I served for 15 years, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I came home with medals, but none of that mattered. Civilian life wasn't easy. I had a job in construction, but after an accident, I couldn't work. Medical bills piled up. My wife, she held on for a while, but eventually she left. Lost my home. The VA took months just to process my paperwork. In the meantime, I had nowhere to go." Trump listened, his expression unreadable. "And no one helped you?" James shook his head. "Some charities gave me food, but nothing long-term. The system forgets people like me." A long silence filled the car. Then Trump spoke. "That changes tonight." James blinked. "Sir, I appreciate what you're doing, but you don't have to. I don't have to do anything." Trump interrupted. "I want to." James didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, someone powerful was listening. As they pulled up to the luxurious hotel, a small crowd had gathered outside. Word had spread fast. Reporters held cameras, waiting to capture this unexpected act of kindness. Trump ignored them and helped James out of the car. Inside, a hotel manager greeted them with a nervous smile. "Mr. Trump, we've arranged everything as you requested." Trump nodded and turned to James. "Tonight, you sleep in a warm bed. Tomorrow, we fix the rest of your life." James, overwhelmed, could only manage a choked, "Thank you." Meanwhile, social media was exploding. The video of Trump helping James had been viewed millions of times. The world was watching. James Carter sat on the plush hotel bed, running his hands over the soft sheets as if trying to convince himself this was real. The last time he had slept somewhere this comfortable was before his life unraveled. He heard a knock at the door. "Come in," James called, expecting a staff member. Instead, Donald Trump walked in, followed by a suited man carrying a leather briefcase. "How's the room?" Trump asked casually, sitting across from James. James exhaled. "It's unreal, sir. I don't know how to thank you." Trump waved off the gratitude. "You earned this. Now let's talk about what's next." He nodded to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Randall. He handles business investments for me." Randall placed the briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing neatly stacked documents. "Mr. Carter, we've gone through your background. You were a disciplined Marine, managed teams, worked in construction. You have leadership skills that are wasted on the streets." James frowned. "I'm not sure where you're going with this." Trump leaned forward. "I'm offering you a job. Not just any job, a real shot at turning your life around. I own several real estate development companies. You've worked in construction before. I want to put you in a management training program, and if you prove yourself, I'll back you in starting your own business." James blinked. He thought he had misheard. "You what?" Trump smirked. "I'm not giving you charity. I'm giving you an opportunity. You work hard, prove your worth, and you'll have a career again. You'll have her dignity back." James's hands trembled, not from the cold this time, but from shock. I don't know what to say." Trump stood. "Say yes." James swallowed hard, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. For years, he had begged for help, only to be ignored or brushed aside. And now, in the span of a few hours, his entire world had changed. He stood up, straightened his shoulders like the Marine he once was, and extended his hand. "Yes, sir." Trump gripped his hand firmly. "Good. Let's get to work." As they shook hands, the cameras outside captured the moment. The story of Trump's generosity wasn't just going viral. It was about to change the conversation about how America treated its veterans. By the next morning, the internet had erupted. News outlets were running the story nonstop. Donald Trump's incredible act of kindness to a struggling veteran. Billionaire's bold gesture sparks debate on veteran support. Trump's viral moment. Genuine compassion or political move. James Carter's name was suddenly everywhere. Reporters were stationed outside the hotel, eager to get a word from him. His face was splashed across television screens, showing the moment he shook hands with Trump and accepted the offer. Social media was equally divided. Some praised Trump's generosity. Say what you want about Trump, but this is a real, life-changing act. Respect. Helping a homeless veteran get back on his feet? That's leadership. Why isn't the government doing this for all our veterans? Others were more skeptical. This is just a PR stunt. If Trump really cared about veterans, he'd do more than just help one guy. I bet this is all for a campaign video. News anchors debated the significance of the moment. Some claimed it was proof of Trump's compassion, while others accused him of using James for publicity. Inside the hotel suite, James scrolled through the headlines on a borrowed phone, his stomach in knots. Trump, meanwhile, sipped his coffee, seemingly unfazed. "People will say what they want," he said. "Doesn't change the fact that your life is turning around." James set the phone down, exhaling. "I don't care about the politics. I just want to prove myself." Trump nodded. "Good answer." A knock on the door interrupted them. A hotel staff member stepped in hesitantly. "Sir, we have someone downstairs asking for Mr. Carter." James frowned. "Who?" The staff member shifted awkwardly. "A woman. Says she's his wife." James's heart stopped. James Carter felt the air leave his lungs. His wife? After all these years, his hands tightened into fists. He hadn't seen or heard from Lisa since the day she walked out, leaving him with nothing but a broken heart and a pile of unpaid bills. Trump noticed his hesitation. "Want to see her?" James swallowed hard. "I don't know." Trump stood and adjusted his jacket. "Edo." He nodded to the staff member. "Send her up." James's pulse pounded in his ears as the minutes stretched. Then the door creaked open. Lisa stepped inside cautiously. She looked different, older, thinner, but her blue eyes were the same, filled with uncertainty and something James couldn't quite place. "James," she whispered. James clenched his jaw. "What are you doing here?" She glanced nervously at Trump, then back at James. "I saw you on the news." She hesitated. "I had to come." James scoffed. "Had to? You left me when I needed you the most." Tears welled in her eyes. I know, and I regret it every single day. Trump leaned back, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a seasoned businessman analyzing a deal. Lisa took a shaky breath. I was scared, James. When you lost your job, when the money ran out, I didn't know how to handle it. I was weak. And when I heard about what you went through, I hated myself. James shook his head. So what? Now that my life is turning around, you just waltz back in? Lisa's lip quivered. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have stood by you. Silence filled the room. Trump finally spoke. People make mistakes, Carter. Question is, what are you going to do about it? James stared at Lisa, emotions warring inside him. He had dreamed of this moment, of confronting her, of making her feel the pain he had felt. But now that she was here, all he felt was exhaustion. I don't know, he admitted. Lisa wiped her tears. I understand. She turned to leave. Wait. James sighed. I need time. But if you're serious about making amends, I'll hear you out. Lisa's eyes widened with hope. Thank you. Trump stood, straightening his jacket. Good. Now that that's settled, Carter, you've got a meeting to prepare for. James blinked. Meeting? Trump smirked. You didn't think I'd let you sit around all day, did you? Time to see if you're really ready for this new life. James took a deep breath. One door had reopened from his past, but another was leading toward his future. He just had to decide which one to walk through. James barely had time to process Lisa's sudden reappearance before he found himself being ushered into the back seat of a sleek black SUV. Trump sat beside him, scrolling through his phone, while Randall, Trump's business strategist, sat in the front seat, flipping through a thick stack of documents. Where are we going? James finally asked. Trump glanced up. A meeting. A big one. You said you wanted a shot. This is it. James shifted uncomfortably. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. Trump smirked. That's what makes it fun. The car pulled up to a towering skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. The moment James stepped out, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, their voices a chaotic blur. Mr. Trump, is this veteran just a publicity stunt? James, how does it feel to be rescued by a billionaire? Is this Trump's way of winning the veteran vote? Trump ignored them, placing a firm hand on James's shoulder and guiding him inside. They entered a lavish boardroom, where a dozen high-powered executives sat waiting. The tension was thick that a stern-looking man in an expensive suit spoke first. Mr. Trump, we appreciate your time, but we weren't expecting an outsider to join us. He shot James a pointed look. Trump leaned back in his chair. James Carter is my guest and my new trainee. If you got a problem with that, you can leave. Silence. No one moved. Randall slid a folder in front of James. You're going to present this real estate proposal, he whispered that James's heart pounded. What? Trump grinned. Time to sink or swim, Carter. James swallowed hard and opened the folder. The pages blurred together. He was about to humiliate himself in front of some of the most powerful people in the industry. Then he took a deep breath and did what the Marines had trained him to do, adapt. Good afternoon, gentlemen. He began, his voice steadier than he felt. I may not be a businessman, but I know what it's like to build something from nothing. And that's what this project is about, giving people the opportunity to rebuild, just like I'm doing right now. The room went still. Trump nodded approvingly. James didn't know if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life or if he had just taken his first real step toward a future he never thought possible. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. James felt the weight of a dozen scrutinizing gazes on him, each executive sizing him up, trying to determine whether he was a bold underdog or a clueless imposter. Trump remained still, a knowing smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Randall, ever the strategist, folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Finally, the stern-looking executive who had questioned James's presence, Richard Holloway, leaned forward. That was an interesting approach, Mr. Carter. James stiffened. Interesting. That could mean anything. Another executive, a woman with sharp eyes and a tailor navy suit, flipped through the proposal James had barely skimmed. You say this project is about rebuilding. Can you explain how it directly connects to veterans like yourself? James took a breath. He had no choice but to trust his instincts. Absolutely, he said, straightening his shoulders. Look, I was on the streets just days ago. I know what it's like to feel discarded, like your best years are behind you. This development isn't just about buildings, it's about second chances. If we integrate veteran housing and job training programs into the plan, we can create opportunities for people who have served this country but never got the support they needed after. A murmur rippled across the room. A few executives exchanged looks. Trump finally spoke, breaking the tension. That, gentlemen, is called thinking outside the box. The question is, are you going to back something meaningful, or are you going to waste my time? Richard Holloway pursed his lips. We'd have to run numbers on the veteran integration. It could increase costs. Randall jumped in. It could also attract government incentives and tax breaks, making a net positive. The woman in Navy nodded thoughtfully. If we position this as a social impact project, it could actually enhance the brand's reputation while still being profitable. James's pulse quickened. Was this really happening? Holloway finally exhaled. Fine, we'll consider it. But Carter, if this fails, the blame is on you. James met his gaze without flinching. Understood. Trump clapped him on the back. Good. Now that we've got that settled, let's talk numbers. As the discussion moved forward, James sat back, barely believing what had just happened. He had walked into this room as a nobody, and now, for the first time in years, he was something more. James stepped out of the boardroom, his pulse still racing. The deal wasn't finalized, but he had done something he never thought possible. He had made an impact. Trump gave him a firm pat on the back. Not bad, Carter. Not bad at all. James exhaled. I thought I was going to crash and burn in there. Trump smirked. You almost did, but you recovered. That's what matters. Randall, however, looked less impressed. That was risky, Carter. Holloway isn't the type to let things go. You put him on the spot, and he doesn't like that. James frowned. I was just answering his questions. Randall shook his head. Doesn't matter. In this world, making the wrong enemies can cost you everything. James hadn't considered that. He thought business was about results, but now he realized it was also about power, about who controlled the narrative. As they exited the building, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. Mr. Trump, was this meeting a political move? James, how does it feel to be handpicked by Donald Trump? Is this all just a publicity stunt? Trump raised a hand. Gentlemen, I don't do stunts. Carter here, he's got the guts to make something of himself, and I respect that. Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got real work to do. James followed Trump to the car, but he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Richard Holloway, standing near the entrance, speaking to a man in a gray suit. The man glanced at James, eyes cold and calculating that a chill ran down James's spine. Who is that? He asked Randall. Randall followed his gaze and sighed. That's Victor Langley. Works with Holloway. He's one of those guys who smiles to your face but will gut you the moment you turn your back. James clenched his jaw. Great. Trump slid into the car. Carter, you want to be successful? You're going to make enemies. Just make sure they never see you sweat. James nodded, but as the car pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped onto a battlefield, one he wasn't prepared for. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. He groggily reached for it, expecting a call from Randall or maybe even Trump. Instead, he found a flood of notifications. His name was all over the news. Ex-homeless veteran becomes Trump's protege, but not everyone is buying it. Was this a setup? Business insiders questioned Trump's new charity case. James Carter, hero or opportunist? James sat up, his stomach twisting. He scrolled through the articles, reading accusation after accusation. Some claimed he was a planted figure to push a political agenda. Others suggested he had exaggerated his struggles to gain sympathy. A few even dug into his past, twisting old military records to paint him as reckless. Then he saw it, that a direct hit from none other than Richard Holloway. I respect Mr. Trump's business acumen, but elevating an unqualified individual to this level of decision-making is reckless. Business isn't about charity. It's about results. And I question whether Mr. Carter has the experience to deliver them. James gritted his teeth. This was exactly what Randall had warned him about. Holloway wasn't just brushing him off. He was actively trying to discredit him. His phone rang. It was Randall. Pick up, James muttered to himself, pressing the answer button. Randall didn't waste time. We've got a problem. You think? James snapped. They're tearing me apart. Randall's voice was calm, but firm. That's how the game is played. You made a splash, and now the sharks are circling. Trump wants to meet. Be at his office in an hour. James exhaled. What's the plan? Randall hesitated. That depends. Are you ready to fight back? Or are you going to let Holloway run you out? James clenched his jaw. He had spent too much of his life being knocked down. He wasn't about to roll over now. I'm in. James arrived at Trump Tower, his nerves tight. The elevators took him up to a conference room with walls of glass that overlooked the city. Inside, Trump, Randall, and several of Trump's senior advisors were already waiting. The atmosphere was charged with energy. Trump was at the head of the table, his usual confident posture a stark contrast to the intensity in the room. Carter, sit down, Trump said, his voice commanding. James took a seat, his hands instinctively resting on the arms of the chair, as if bracing for what was to come. Trump wasted no time. So, I see the world starting to wonder if you're just my latest publicity stunt. He looked at James with a steely expression. What's your response? James's throat tightened, but he knew he had to be bold. I'm not a stunt. I'm not here for charity or sympathy. I'm here because I earned this chance, and I'll make the most of it. Trump studied him for a moment, as if sizing him up. Then he nodded slowly. Good answer, but the media is not going to back off. They'll try to bury you if they can. Randall leaned in. We've been monitoring the backlash. Holloway's making moves behind the scenes. He's trying to discredit James by painting him as unqualified, a pawn in Trump's game. James frowned. I don't care what Holloway thinks. He doesn't know me. Trump chuckled darkly. It's not about what he knows. It's about what he can make people believe. That's the game. One of Trump's advisors, a sharp woman in her 40s named Elena, spoke up. We need a strategy to flip the narrative. Right now, people think you're an underdog who's getting a free ride. We need to show them you've got the chops to back up this deal. James felt the weight of her words. How do we do that? Elena smiled. We go public. You take control of the story. We'll set up an exclusive interview where you tell your side of things, your struggles, your journey. People will see the real you, not the media's twisted version. Trump nodded in agreement. I like it, but it's not enough to just tell your story, Carter. You need to deliver. We'll put you in front of the right crowd, business leaders, veterans, influencers. Make them see what Holloway's too blind to get. You're not just a charity case. You're an opportunity. James's heart pounded. He had no idea what he was about to face, but he could already sense that this was his moment to prove everything. How do we do it? James asked. Trump's grin was as sharp as ever. We'll make the media work for you. They want a story? Let's give them one. You'll step up, you'll fight, and we'll make sure Holloway knows he's messing with the wrong guy. The next few days were a whirlwind. James had expected the media attention to be intense, but he hadn't anticipated how relentless it would become. The scrutiny wasn't just about his qualifications anymore. It was about his entire existence in the business world. But James was ready to face it head-on. The plan was simple but ambitious. Trump's team had arranged for a massive media push. James was going to sit down for an exclusive, high-profile interview where he would tell his story in his own words. It wasn't going to be some sanitized version. They wanted the raw, unfiltered truth. The night before the interview, James stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. He wasn't the man he had been just a few short months ago, a man struggling to survive on the streets. He was different now, stronger, sharper, more determined. Tomorrow is everything, he muttered to himself, his reflections seeming to echo the words. The next morning, James entered the glitzy studio set in Manhattan. Cameras, lights, and reporters filled the space. Trump's team was there too, hovering nearby, making sure everything went according to plan. Elena was the one who briefed him. You're not just telling your story, James. You're flipping the narrative. We want people to understand what you've been through. But more importantly, we want them to see what you're capable of. James nodded. He had rehearsed the key points, but this wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about making people feel what he had lived. The interview began, and the host, a polished news anchor named Bill Sutherland, flashed a charming smile at the camera. Today, we have a special guest, James Carter, a former veteran who went from living on the streets to working with one of the most influential businessmen in the world, Donald Trump. James, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for having me. James replied, his voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at his insides. Sutherland leaned forward. Let's start with your story. You've made headlines recently, but many are questioning whether your success is truly earned. You're a former homeless veteran who's now partnered with Donald Trump. Some people are calling this a PR stunt. How do you respond? James took a deep breath, fighting the rush of emotions that came with the question. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be anyone's charity case. I fought for this country, and when I came back, I was left to fend for myself. I was on the streets because no one cared, but I didn't give up. I worked hard, learned from my mistakes, and found my way back. I'm here today because of my efforts, not because of any handout. Sutherland's expression softened slightly. And how does it feel to now be in business with someone like Donald Trump, someone who has made his fortune in real estate? James paused. It feels earned. Trump saw something in me that others didn't. He saw potential. He saw that I wasn't just looking for a quick fix. I'm here to make a difference, to prove that people like me, people who have been written off, can rise up. I'm not just a veteran who needs saving. I'm someone who's ready to help change the system. There was a murmur of approval from the crew behind the cameras. Sutherland pressed on, sensing a shift in the tone. But there are critics, James. People like Richard Holloway, a business leader you've already clashed with, say that you're unqualified. They say you're taking a chance with something you don't fully understand. James didn't flinch. Holloway's entitled to his opinion. But let me tell you something. Business isn't about being handed everything on a silver platter. It's about taking risks, being resourceful, and pushing past your limits. I've done that every single day of my life. I'm not here to be a figurehead. I'm here to make this work. And I will. The room was silent for a beat. Sutherland, sensing the power behind James's words, let the silence linger before speaking again. There's a lot riding on this, James. You've just gone from being a man on the streets to being involved in a multi-million-dollar project. How do you plan to prove your critics wrong? James didn't hesitate. I'm going to deliver. I'm going to build something that matters. This project isn't just about buildings. It's about giving veterans, people like me, a chance to succeed. It's about proving that if you work hard enough, you can rise above anything, no matter where you start. The host nodded, clearly impressed. But James wasn't done. And if I fail, he added, his voice calm but firm, it'll be on me. But I'm betting on myself, and I won't let anyone take that away from me. The interview ended shortly after that, but the impact lingered. James had just done what many said he couldn't. He had stood up to his critics, made his case, and taken control of the narrative. The interview aired later that evening, and within hours, it went viral. Social media exploded with reactions from all corners of the globe. Some people hailed James as a hero, while others criticized him for his bold stance. The divide was clear. He had made a statement, and it had resonated with many. But just as many were still skeptical. At first, it seemed like a victory. James saw the waves of support rolling in, the messages of encouragement from veterans, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens. But he couldn't escape the feeling that the storm was far from over. The phone calls came fast and furious. Randall was the first to reach out. You did it, James, Randall said, his voice full of pride. You showed the world what you're made of. James wasn't sure if he should feel proud or anxious. The interviews had gone well, but now the real test was beginning. Thanks, Randall, but this is just the beginning, right? James replied, I've seen what's out there. People aren't just going to hand me success because I told my story. I've got to prove it. You've got this, Randall reassured him. Just stay the course, keep your head down, and don't let the noise distract you. It's all part of the process. James nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that the backlash was brewing. As he left the interview studio, the first signs of tension were already visible. James had been on TV, but now he had to step into the real world of high-stakes business. The following morning, as James walked into his temporary office in Trump Tower, he noticed the change in the air. People were looking at him differently, some with respect, others with skepticism. He had made an impression, but now it was time to back it up. His first meeting of the day was with Trump's business team. Elena greeted him as he walked into the conference room. "You did well last night," she said with a smile. "But we've got to keep pushing." Holloway's not backing down, and he's already planning his next move. James braced himself. "What's the next step?" Elena flipped through a binder. "We need to show results. A lot of people have their eyes on this project, and they're waiting for you to stumble. We've got to prove we're serious. Let's set up a press event where you can announce the first phase of the project, show that we're making progress." James thought for a moment. "How do we make sure it's different this time? I don't want to just make another announcement. I need to show people that this isn't a game. This is real." Trump, who had been listening quietly from the other side of the room, leaned forward. "You want to do something bold? Take action. Get out there in front of the press, in front of the people. Show them what you're building, what you're working on. Make them feel the energy. They won't believe it until they see it." James looked at Trump, understanding his point. "All right, let's do it." Later that week, James found himself standing in front of a crowd of reporters, photographers, and business leaders. The grand unveiling of the first phase of the project was underway, and he was ready to prove himself. The event was being held at an old warehouse that was being renovated as part of the new development, a space that would eventually house a center for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. The building was a mess of construction workers and half-done walls, but that's exactly why James had chosen it. "This is where the real work happens," he told the crowd, standing at the front of the room with a microphone in hand. "This is where we build, where we transform, and where we change lives." His words echoed through the room, and for a moment, James saw something in the crowd he hadn't expected: genuine curiosity. People weren't just looking at him as a figurehead anymore. They were looking at what he was doing. "This project isn't just about business," James continued. "It's about building a foundation for those who've been left behind, for the people who gave everything and got nothing in return. I'm here to change that." As James spoke, the tension in the room began to dissipate. He wasn't just talking about a building. He was talking about hope. The media coverage was immediate and intense. This time, it wasn't just about his past struggles. This was about his vision, his commitment to following through. The press event had been a success. James had delivered his message with passion, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly being heard. The media buzzed with praise, and even some of his critics were starting to soften. He had made an impact, but he knew it wasn't over. The project was moving forward, but with each step, the pressure mounted. The glare of the media spotlight wasn't something James could ignore. Every move he made was dissected, analyzed, and scrutinized. That a few days after the unveiling event, James received an unexpected call. It was from his former commanding officer, Colonel Jack Daniels, who had been one of the few people who'd stood by him during his darkest days on the streets. "James, I've been keeping an eye on your progress. I'm proud of you, but I need to warn you, there's a storm coming." James' heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, Colonel?" "The media is relentless, and your past is about to catch up with you. There are people from your old life, from the military, who don't want to see you succeed. They want to tear you down." James' stomach tightened. He had always known that his past was something he couldn't fully escape, but hearing the colonel's warning made the threat feel more real. "I've got this under control," James replied, though doubt crept into his voice. "But what do I need to look out for?" "You need to be prepared. There's a person in your past, someone who knows everything about you. They're going to use that to bring you down. If I were you, I'd find them before they find you." The line went dead as Colonel Daniels hung up. James stood there, holding the phone to his ear, trying to process what he'd just heard. The next morning, James couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. He had made it this far, but now, it felt like his entire world was on the verge of collapsing. He couldn't let his past destroy what he had worked so hard to build. But who was this person, and what did they know? Determined to get ahead of the storm, James called Elena. "We need to meet. Something's going on." When they sat down together later that day, Elena could tell that something was wrong. "What's going on, James?" she asked, her voice full of concern. James explained the call he had received from Colonel Daniels, leaving out some of the more personal details. He didn't want to show weakness, but he also couldn't ignore the warning. "This is bad," Elena said, after listening intently. "You can't afford to let this affect your image right now. We need to find out who this person is and what they're planning." James nodded. I'll track them down. I can't let this go unchecked. Elena frowned. Don't do this alone. We have a team for a reason. Let us help. James hesitated. He wasn't used to relying on others, but he knew this was bigger than anything he had faced before. Okay, let's do this together. The team's investigation into James' past didn't take long to uncover the name of the person who could derail everything. It was a man named Michael Jennings, a former comrade who had served with James during his last deployment. Jennings had been a troublemaker, someone who had a knack for stirring up conflict. He knew things about James that no one else did, things James had tried to bury long ago. Jennings is dangerous, Randall said, his face grim as they gathered in the conference room. He's the kind of person who will use anything, even the darkest parts of your past, to destroy you. James was determined. We need to confront him before he can get to us. But Elena's cautionary words stopped him. We don't know what he's planning yet. Jumping into this without a plan could make things worse. James didn't want to wait. He needed to act now. We don't have time to wait. He's already out there, and he's getting closer. Later that night, James found himself standing in front of a dilapidated apartment building on the outskirts of the city. Jennings' address had been easy to find. He hadn't exactly been hiding. James took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. This was it. The moment he'd been dreading. He knocked on the door. After a long silence, the door creaked open, revealing a man who hadn't aged well. Michael Jennings was thinner than James remembered, his face drawn and tired, but there was no mistaking the malicious gleam in his eyes. Well, Jennings sneered. The great James Carter. I was wondering when you'd come crawling back. James stood tall, his voice steady. I'm not here to crawl, Jennings. I'm here to make sure you don't destroy everything I've worked for. Jennings laughed bitterly. You think you can stop me? You think you can erase everything you've done? You don't get to run away from your past, Carter. It's going to catch up to you. James' heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment he would either break or rise above everything that had ever held him back. I don't need you to remind me of my past, James said firmly. But I'm not afraid of it anymore. I've learned from it. And no matter what you do, you're not going to stop me. Jennings stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether to push further. Finally, he spoke, his tone menacing. I hope you're ready, James, because you're not going to win this one. The words hung in the air, thick with menace. Jennings' warning echoed in James' mind as he left the rundown apartment building. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jennings had something planned, something far worse than he was letting on. As James walked away, he knew he had to prepare for the worst. Jennings had a way of making everything seem like a game, but for James, this was no game. He had a mission, and it was bigger than just proving himself to the public. It was about redemption, about rewriting the narrative that had haunted him for years. Back at Trump Tower, James gathered his team. Elena, Randall, and the rest of the crew were ready to help. But there was something different in the air now. The tension was palpable. The stakes were higher than ever, and James knew that the time for talking was over. We have to strike first, James said, his voice steady but determined. Jennings is going to play dirty, and we can't afford to be reactive. We need to take control of the situation. Elena looked at him, concern in her eyes. Are you sure about this, James? Confronting him head-on could make things worse. James locked eyes with her, his resolve firm. I'm not running anymore. If you want to fight, he'll get one. The next morning, as the team finalized their strategy, a breaking news alert flashed on every screen in the office. The headline read, Ex-veteran James Carter under investigation for fraud. Accusations surface of misusing funds for veteran project. James' stomach dropped as he read the article. His worst fears were coming true. Someone had planted the seeds of doubt, and now the media was running with it. Elena turned to him, her face pale. This is it. Jennings must have leaked this. I knew it, James muttered, clenching his fists. He's trying to destroy everything. But instead of panic, James felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let this accusation define him. We fight back, James said, his voice hard as steel. We prove the truth. We go public. No more hiding. James and his team went to work, gathering evidence, speaking to veterans who had benefited from the project, and contacting reporters who had supported James in the past. They pulled together a press conference to refute the allegations, but James knew it wouldn't be easy. The media would be relentless, and Jennings was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next move. On the day of the press conference, the atmosphere in the room was electric. Reporters, cameras, and microphones surrounded James as he stood at the podium. "I'm here today to address the false allegations against me," James began, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "The project we're building is real. It's not about me. It's about the men and women who serve this country and are struggling to find their place in society. That's what matters." He took a deep breath before continuing. "The accusations of fraud are nothing but an attempt to derail the progress we've made. I'm not here to fight for my reputation. I'm here to fight for the veterans who need us. And I'll be damned if I let someone like Michael Jennings tear that down." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The response was immediate. Social media exploded with support from veterans, military families, and even those who had initially doubted him. The tide was turning. People began sharing their stories of how the project had impacted their lives, countering the accusations with first-hand accounts. Jennings, however, wasn't backing down. A few days after the press conference, James received another call from his former comrade. "You think you've won, Carter?" Jennings' voice dripped with disdain. "You're nothing but a fraud, a thief. Everyone's going to find out what you really are. I've got more than just a few bad rumors. I've got the truth, and I'll make sure the world knows it." James could hear the man's anger, but he wasn't scared. He had faced worse before. This was just another obstacle to overcome. "I'm not afraid of you, Jennings," James replied, his voice steady. "You can't break me anymore." Jennings laughed bitterly. "We'll see about that." Days passed, and the media frenzy surrounding the accusations began to quiet down. James knew that it wasn't over yet, but he felt a sense of control he hadn't had before. The storm had passed, but it was clear that Jennings wasn't finished. Elena sat down with him in the office one evening. "You did it. The public is on your side. But Jennings is still out there." James nodded. "I know, but this time, I'm not just reacting to him. I'm going to take the fight to him. If he wants to ruin me, he's going to have to do it on his terms. And I'll make sure he pays for it." A few days later, James received a message from a source, someone who claimed to know Jennings' next move. The tip was simple but crucial. Michael Jennings had contacted a former associate in an attempt to leak fabricated documents about James' past, claiming he had been dishonorably discharged from the military. James knew he had to act quickly. If Jennings managed to leak those documents, everything he had worked for would come crashing down. He reached out to his legal team and set a meeting with Trump's office. "We need to stop this before it gets out of control," James said. "If Jennings tries to leak those papers, we'll have nothing to fight against." Trump's team worked quickly, using their connections to shut down the potential leak. It wasn't a pretty process, and it involved a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, but in the end, they succeeded. The next day, a public statement was made, clearing James of all wrongdoing and exposing Jennings as the manipulator he was. The media turned their focus to Jennings, digging into his background, uncovering his past mistakes and questioning his motives. The days that followed the media expose were a whirlwind. Jennings had been exposed for his deceit, and the public was turning their back on him. The once powerful figure who had been so skilled at pulling strings in the shadows now found himself out in the open, vulnerable and without allies. His reputation, carefully crafted over the years, was in tatters. James had won the battle, but the war was still far from over. There was still one final confrontation to face, the one that would decide everything. It would take more than just the press conference or legal maneuvering to make sure Jennings was truly finished. James knew that the only way to end this once and for all was to confront Jennings head on. It was an unexpected setting for the final showdown. An old, empty warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where shady deals were made and secrets were buried. Jennings had arranged the meeting, and James had no intention of letting this be anything other than the last conversation they'd ever have. Elena and the team were hesitant about James going alone, but he insisted. "This is my fight now. If I can't take him down myself, then everything we've done so far will have been for nothing." James walked into the warehouse with his head held high, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of Jennings. The space was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The air smelled of rust and decay, a fitting metaphor for the man he was about to face. There, in the far corner of the warehouse, stood Michael Jennings, waiting with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. The years of manipulation, of plotting, had taken their toll on him. He looked older, more tired, but still dangerous. "Carter," Jennings said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I should have known you'd come here to finish this. You really think you can win? You're nothing but a pawn in a game that's already been played." James didn't flinch. "This ends now, Jennings. No more lies, no more games. You can't keep running your schemes from the shadows. The truth's out, and you've lost." Jennings chuckled, a hollow sound. "Lost? You think this is about winning or losing? This is about survival. And you're too naive to understand what it really takes to survive in this world." James took a step forward, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I'm not the man I was when you first came into my life. You try to break me, make me question everything I stand for. But I've learned something, Jennings. The truth always wins in the end. And I'll be damned if I let you keep hurting people for your own gain." Jennings' face twisted in anger. "You're a fool. You think this is over? You think you've won? The world doesn't work like that. People like you don't get to dictate the rules. I make the rules." The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. But James wasn't intimidated. He had faced much worse than this, and he knew that this moment, this confrontation, was a chance to finally close the door on everything Jennings had done to him, to his reputation, and to those he cared about. "I've already won," James said, his voice cold and final. "You're finished. The truth is out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The world knows who you are now." Jennings' eyes flickered with something darker, something that James hadn't expected: fear. For the first time in their entire ordeal, Jennings was the one on the defensive. The confident, ruthless man who had spent years pulling the strings was now facing the consequences of his actions. "You think you've got me, don't you?" Jennings spat, his face red with rage. "You think this is the end? You have no idea what's coming. I'll take you down, Carter. You can't stop me." But before Jennings could say another word, the door to the warehouse slammed open. James turned, his heart racing. Standing there in the doorway were Elena and the rest of his team, each of them armed with evidence, documents, phone records, and testimony from those who had been hurt by Jennings' manipulations. "We've got everything we need, Jennings," Elena said, her voice sharp. "It's over. You're done." The weight of the moment crashed down on Jennings. His eyes widened as he realized the trap he had walked into. There was no way out now. Within hours, the authorities arrived. Jennings was arrested, his reign of terror finally over. James had done what he set out to do, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had suffered because of Jennings' greed and manipulation. The case against Jennings was airtight, and there was no room for his usual escape routes. The public had turned against him, and his connections couldn't save him this time. As the police led Jennings away in handcuffs, James stood tall, watching it all unfold. He had taken back control of his life, of his story. The years of struggle, of fighting against the tide, had led him to this moment. Elena walked up to him, a proud smile on her face. "You did it, James. You finished it." James nodded, the weight of everything finally lifting from his shoulders. "No, we did it. Together." The fallout from Jennings' arrest was swift. News outlets covered every angle of the story, exposing his crimes and his attempts to destroy James' career. The public was outraged, and those who had once supported Jennings turned their backs on him. His empire crumbled as quickly as it had been built, and the truth finally took its rightful place in the spotlight. For James, it wasn't just about revenge or proving his innocence. It was about something deeper. It was about redemption, about showing the world and himself that no matter how dark things had gotten, he could rise above it all. Months passed, and the dust settled. James' veteran project flourished, gaining more support than ever before. The public had seen his true character, and they were willing to stand by him. Donations flooded in, and veterans from all across the country came forward to express their gratitude for the work James and his team were doing for Jennings. His name became synonymous with corruption and deceit. His downfall had been swift, but James knew that the true victory wasn't in his enemy's defeat. It was in the lives he was helping to change. James had finally found his peace. The road ahead was still challenging, but for the first time in years, he knew he was on the right path.